today's World Insight with Ken Wei, U.S. midterm elections loom large. How will it affect Trump's trade and security agenda?
The military relationship is critical. The broader relationship between our two countries.
And our exclusive interview with Senior Colonel Zhou Bo from the Chinese military about the U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis' visit to China. Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live on CGTN. We begin our program today in the United States, where the November midterm elections will determine control of the Congress. Hot-button controversies hounded the Trump administration in recent months, including an uproar over the separation of immigrant children from parents, disputes with major trade partners, and Republican primary elections. According to a new Pew Research poll released last week, around 60% of U.S. voters said they consider their midterm vote as essentially a vote either for Donald Trump or against him. Before we get down to business with our panelists, let's take a look at this.
Less than 5 months until the U.S. midterm elections, Mr. Trump's immigration policy has sent ripples both inside and outside the U.S. One thing is clear for now: the U.S. Supreme Court has upheld Mr. Trump's travel ban on several Muslim-majority countries.
Today's Supreme Court ruling just coming out, a tremendous success, a tremendous victory for the American people and for our Constitution. This is a great victory for our Constitution.
Critics were up in arms over what they see as the Trump administration zeroing in on Muslims from 7 countries. Another migrant lightning rod over the separation of immigrant children from their parents fueled protests at the U.S. southern border. Over a dozen American states, such as Washington, New York, and California, are suing the government over the practice.
It's inhumane. It breaks my heart, and it needs to stop now, and they need to reunite the families that they've already traumatized.
The separation stemmed from a zero-tolerance policy, which prosecutes all adults across the U.S. border illegally, including those traveling with children. Mr. Trump last week issued an executive order to keep families together, but his own party has failed to pass an immigration bill in the Republican-controlled House of Representatives. On the trade front, U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum did not sit well with America's closest allies in the European Union, Japan, its neighbors Canada and Mexico, and its big trading partner across the Pacific, China. All of them warned of retaliatory duties. Iconic American motorbike manufacturer Harley-Davidson has become the latest victim of the battle over tariffs. The company is now shifting the manufacturing of its popular motorcycles overseas to avoid retaliatory European tariffs imposed last week. For the Republican primary elections, the so-called Trump effect was seen as 7 U.S. states held primaries or runoffs on Tuesday, with at least 3 Republican candidates projected as winners thanks to the president's endorsement.
For more on the latest related to U.S. midterm elections and U.S. politics, we are joined in our Beijing studio Wang Yiwei, expert advisor coming from CCPIT Advisory Committee. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in Washington, D.C., Steve Pruitt, managing partner at Watts Partners, and he's also a very seasoned analyst about the Capitol Hill from the U.S. Also in Washington, Morgan Muchnick, who is the founder of the M2 Group, that's a government and public affairs firm. He's also a Republican strategist. Welcome as well. I want to begin with you, Mr. Pruitt. We talked several times already, and things are changing all the time. So tell us about the latest climate, in a way, political climate in the United States regarding some of the recent controversies, immigration, trade issue, as well as so-called civility issues in the U.S. politics.
Well, I think in response first to your question, there's a saying that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And I think those of us who've been watching the political scene here in Washington and across the nation since January of 2017 would probably, I think, conclude that much of what we're seeing now is what we expected last January. Also, I think the current events really play into the script that many of us have been continuing to etch out about Trump governance as it relates to how America is not only operating but being perceived in the world.
Right.
And I think we've got a couple of things that are pretty clear. There's no consensus agenda. There's a focus by Trump pretty much on protection of the Trump brand. And there are major questions out there as to what that 40% or 41% really means and who they are. So I think
that is the big question, isn't it? Let me chop this down into several things. First of all, immigration issue. Mr. Muchnick, about that mixed picture for President Trump. Supreme Court, of course, the ruling is very much pro his earlier stance. However, at the same time, Mr. Muchnick, it seems that about the family separation along the border, particularly in the state of Texas, about the so-called illegal immigrants, is still an issue hanging in the air. People do not know where political wind is going to go. What do you say?
Well, first, I want to make a very clear distinction. This happens all the time. You said it correctly just now, but in the beginning of the lead-up, you talked about separation of immigrants. But these are illegal immigrants. Immigrants are not being taken anywhere, any place. Immigrants are citizens of the United States. These are folks who are trying to cross the border illegally. Now, the process that's being done is inhumane, and it's about time that's being fixed, and it's great that light has been shown onto it. But that aside, the polling shows clearly that the president is not being punished for the controversy, surrounding the drama around separation of families. His polling numbers have not changed much. They've inched up a little bit, inched down a little bit. We in the Beltway sometimes get caught up by massive amounts of political noise and drama and TV and views that we see in screens that look difficult to watch, and often are. But in reality, the president's numbers and the popularity of the president hasn't really moved a tremendous amount either way throughout this past week or week and a half of what many would say is a negative side for him, a difficult period for him. But
so you're saying the immigration issue, or quote-unquote immigration-related issue, is not necessarily putting much pressure on the president's political stakes at all, right now, at least.
No, that's exactly right. In fact, and there's a great saying amongst international affairs community about the Palestinians in the Israel situation. It says, the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And I believe that's what the Democratic Party are doing now.
Okay, I can tell very clearly your political stance now with that quote. And let me go to you once again, Mr. Pruitt. Do you think this is already, in a way, a safe zone for President Trump?
No, in fact, I would probably say it's a danger zone, because while my colleague points out that the numbers have pretty much remained the same, the fact that they've remained the same and not expanded to give the Republicans that margin of effort that would give them an easier run in the elections, I think is going to ultimately end up being a real problem for them.
Right. A lot of political issues going on inside the United States, inside Washington, D.C., particularly Professor Wang here in Beijing. I just wondered, as someone from the Chinese side who is observing this trade dispute going on between the two countries, how do you make of the, the inside political stories going on inside the United States, and how do you think that is really related to the agenda of the current administration and the government, that their way of approaching China?
Of course, it's not directly linked to well, U.S. is a politics, economy, polarization. I think it's a very key word to understand of that. So what the President Trump is doing is considered about the domestic affairs. So it's not about too much corporate value thinking or international response. So his approval rate is still rising. Yes. So given that, he's defending on the American interests from the more jobs back and more safety for the people, So the people, American people, don't understand so much about the outside world and don't care so much about the external feeling.
Well, that's a big statement. Whether that is true or not, we're going to put out there for debate later in our program. And also for now, we are joined by another guest coming from the European continent, Ian Begg, who is a professor at the European Institute with the London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Begg, welcome to our program as well. The trade disputes between Washington and its allies, let's just say European Union, Canada, and some of the others, are certainly become also internal political stories inside Washington as well. Do you see, Professor Begg, coming from the European perspective, your opinions matter much to what the Americans going to do?
I think what the Americans are doing is driven by the very unusual phenomenon of Trump, who in some ways is a paradox. He is unpredictable, or maybe unorthodox, and yet in many ways he's doing exactly what he said he would do, so that the Europeans have to accommodate to the fact that he is a new phenomenon in politics. And they're having great trouble working out the correct approach to this, which in turn reflects back on what Washington is able to do. So there's this strange kind of impasse between the two sides, circling each other, trying to figure out what each is trying to do.
So it's a way of doing things that the Europeans haven't figured out about how to deal with Trump, or is it about the value behind the ways of doing things that the Europeans haven't figured out about how to deal with Trump?
I think both the things you raise, Wei, and others, because what's happening is that we have the common value, at least we thought we had, of free trade being very much up there at the top of the list. And yet the actions of Trump have undermined that, and then you get the retaliations coming in from not just the Europeans but from other parts of the world, Canada, China.
Yeah.
And that creates a new environment in which figuring out who wants what then gets connected to the security issues around NATO and leaves everybody a bit uncertain about the next steps.
Of course, the Europeans are also taking their time trying to form some kinds of small military to deal with what the Europeans call, crisis, whether it's natural disaster or some of the other things NATO felt they probably would be sidelined as a result of that. Having said that, though, let me go back to you, Mr. Puig, about that, about what the Europeans are doing. Harley-Davidson, for example, that's an important American enterprise, manufacturing. It decided to move its manufacturing bases elsewhere in the world, particularly to some of the European places, because of the high tariffs the Europeans going to put on the Harley-Davidson exports because of the retaliation against Trump's tariffs. So how do you see this debate going on about trade between yours and that of the American allies? Is that going to be the same, similar between U.S. and China's?
Well, the short answer is yes, but I think, as I've said on your program before, I've encouraged people not to look at Trump using traditional political metrics since he came into office. I think everyone should have known, based on what he was saying during the campaign, a lot of information that suggests he was not going to govern in traditional ways. And from that perspective, the challenge has been for both the Europeans, the Chinese, and others to recalculate and readjust how they interact with America. And I think some parts of the world are doing better than others in terms of developing their own plans and moving forward with their plans. As it relates to Harley-Davidson, I think they're already and have been for some time manufacturing outside of the U.S. And I think when you strip back the rhetoric and really look at what is going on there, you'll see that they see market growth outside of the U.S. There's almost a Harley on every corner here in America, so they want to sell more motorcycles, and they see growth outside. And taking that manufacturing overseas from a business perspective is the most efficient way of doing it for them at this point in time. So while I would certainly, from a partisan perspective, sit back and applaud this and use it as an example of how Trump's policies are hurting us, I think you also have to factor in what the real business activities are that are that are underlying these moves.
That's right. Their sales in the U.S. market down 9% in the year 2017, while their sales in the European market only 0.6%. So you know why they're moving things. So, Mr. Muchnik, I wonder from your political perspective, do you agree with that?
Well, yeah, I mean, nothing he said was incorrect, but he did leave out some facts, and a number of facts have been left out throughout this discussion. First is Harley-Davidson, my understanding, is that they're only moving their production for bikes to be sold outside of the U.S. to move outside of the U.S. Every motorcycle, I believe, that is going to be sold to an American or someone living in the U.S. is still going to be produced in the United States. It's not just as simplistic as they're moving their production offshore because the costs are lower. Big companies never operate that simplistically. It's a sort of trite analysis to take because you're trying to put this into a political lens, but it's a macroeconomic lens that should be applied to us. Secondly, it's also a little bit disingenuous for some folks to say that out of nowhere this American president has started to do this sort of protectionist policy. Both parties in the United States, both Republican and Democrat, for 50, 60, 70 years, have basically been practicing the same sort of surrender to what a lot of us see as unfair trade practices by Europe and Asia and other places, and we just sort of take it. This president is the first president to ever sort of push back a little bit. Because we're starting from a place where America is at a disadvantage and we're trying to push back, doesn't mean that we are becoming aggressive or protectionist against the world.
Okay.
It's not fair.
All right.
I'm not someone who's super supportive of all of the tariffs and the stuff going on, but to be objective about it, one would have to say that it's not like China and Europe is just wide open offering everything without any barriers, and we're the ones who are offering these unfair practices.
Okay, Professor Bagg, Mr. Muchnik are saying, well, you are Europeans, you're taking advantage of us for 50 to 60 years. I think that's the time spread that he's been talking about.
Well, if you consider the military question, there's no doubt that the U.S. spends more to protect Europe than Europe spends to protect itself, and that inequity is there. However, you've got to be rather cautious about making sweeping statements on trade, because the whole story behind trade is that it benefits both sides. The U.S. has near full employment. The growth rate is strong, and that's not because of Trump. It's because of what's happened over the last 30, 40, 50 years, the foreign investment that's taking place. European companies that are invested in the U.S. and are helping to keep that economy going. So the openness of the system is something that is being undermined by Trump's policies. And just as an aside, going back to Harley-Davidson, I think it's fair to say that Trump is an equal opportunity insulter. He insults everybody. But he has to be very careful with Harley-Davidson, because the biking community in the U.S. is not going to like their hogs being insulted in the way that some others have been.
We'll see how they're going to vote, and that is exactly the question, isn't it, Professor Wang, when you are listening to your colleagues from all over the world, U.S. and Europe, talking about what might be influencing the midterm election, which is the big political event inside the United States. And some wonder, Professor Wang, how will all these events eventually settle down into the political atmosphere inside Washington? Of course, you're coming from China, but people here in China also wondering whether that is having too much impact on what is going on between these two countries. Professor Wang.
I think different with the Europeans, that we understand that Trump is not his personal style or phenomena. Actually, the American economic structure changed, American society also changed. So President Trump, I think, is very likely to be re-elected or even win the midterm elections, because Americans' economy is very strong, because his behavior seems like a very, very patriotic to defend American interests. And Americans' power compared to all other powers except for China and India are still growing. I think the Americans feel the confidence is more coming back.
Whether you believe the numbers or not, we need to throw those numbers at you, because they are the only evidence that could help us to understand from outside the United States exactly what's going on. Mr. Trump's job approval ratings have remained in the 40s since mid-April, when unemployment rates plummeted to historical low level. His ratings now is similar to that of Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama in June on their second year in the office. You can take a look at those numbers: 40, 42, 44, 44, 47, all in the 40-something range. And all four of those presidents have a rough sailing through the midterm elections, at least the very first midterm elections they encounter. Having said that, though, here's the important question. The earlier we talked about, Mr. Puig, immigration issue, trade issue. But now, here's the thing. What is going on inside the United States? You heard about the White House spokesperson complaining about she is not able to get into the restaurant. You also heard about the Democrat, some of the, Congress members suggesting that there should be demonstrations against any officials coming from the Trump administration whenever they visit whatever the localities inside the United States. So some wonder whether politics has gone out of control. Mr. Puig, as a seasoned analyst in the Beltway for long, what do you say?
Well, I don't believe that politics have gone out of control, and I believe that what we're seeing and what's being portrayed in the media has been portrayed for many, many years as a dynamic of not only U.S. politics, but of our practice of our First Amendment free speech rights. But what I do see in all of this is a struggle between those folks who are angry and those folks who are energized. And I think at this point, again, looking historically, but certainly not trying to be trapped by tradition, I think there's certainly more energy on the Democratic side. That's been shown literally since 3 days after the inauguration of President Trump, when you had one of the largest demonstrations, the Women's March. And those marches around women's guns and other issues have only continued and have continued at record numbers. And I think when you look at where the energy is and who is likely to appreciate and act upon their desires for a different America, this energy is certainly on the Democratic side this time. But I think, again, at some point we're worried, I think, on the Democratic side.
Okay.
At what point is Trump able to make his base mad?
Well,
and so far he hasn't come up with the right issues to do that.
It seems that it is not the situation yet, right? As you just said, Mr. Puig. Therefore, when I go to Mr. Muchnick, you saw the fact of the 7 primaries that is going on right now. Quite a number of candidates coming from the Republican Party. Once they are graced by the appearance of Donald Trump, the president, they seem to do very well. At least that is the number that we are looking at right now. So what is going to be this brand of Donald Trump eventually for the midterm election? That's a very interesting question.
Yeah, and I agree. There's no question that we are living, I disagree with my previous guest. I believe this is different than it has been in the past. The party in power in the midterms has almost always, and you listed off the presidents, have always done poorly. And that is because people tend to vote against something rather than for something, because the midterms are usually vote against something that's happening in America. And that's happening on both sides. President George W. Bush is the first president in the modern era that actually bucked that trend in his first term. But that being said, if you would have asked me a few months ago, I would have said it's going to be a very bad election for the Republicans, that the Democrats were going to do very well because of the anger issue and the sort of polarization effect and the like. But when I go back to what I said before about never missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity, I believe that the media, which is basically, for the most part, not 100%, but for the most part, basically in line with the Democratic Party, going way cartoonishly overboard on Trump attacks. Everything is a Nazi this, everything Trump does is the end of the world that. Going so far overboard is really, I think, hurt the Democratic brand.
Okay.
And it's brought Republicans more in line with the president. So I actually think that today, sitting here, I give the president's party, Republican Party, a much better chance to have a less bad event than I did a few months ago.
Okay.
And the Democrats are just looking for ways to ruin it for themselves. They had everything lined up.
Let's hear, with the current atmosphere, political atmosphere in the United States, what can China do? I mean, it seems that President Trump is still sailing. and they have enough internal issues to deal with, Professor Wang, and yet these issues might also influence the administration's way of dealing with China and their international agenda, whether it's trade or security. Professor Wang.
We should think about this phenomenon from a long perspective because of the globalization's impact. The structure, economy, and the political of the United States have actually fundamentally changed. Look, there's a map, compare the previous time. The industries, so many states, they have more than half, but now only several very limited states that are still industrialized. So it's the industry empty, make the workers employment, and then suffered of so much, and also the middle class.
So your point is?
Well, my point is, so this is a long-term trend, just beginning.
Okay, and last but not least, from Professor Beck in the UK, what would you say? What does that say about how the Europeans should be alerted and find a way to deal with the United States now?
Well, the Europeans have been used to what you could broadly call a benevolent United States, one which looks after them, one which leads the way in global trade and economic arrangements. As that turns to a more aggressive, more assertive United States, figuring out how to deal with this new United States is taking time, and that's where I think the Europeans are stuck. Where it leaves them is sometimes trying to be friendly, like Macron was initially, sometimes trying to be aggressive, as some others have been in response to him. But just think about what's changed over the last 4 months with Trump, whether it's Korea, blowing up a G7 summit, all the rest of it, and consider there are 4 months till these midterm elections. A huge amount can happen in that time.
Right. A lot of things could happen during those periods of time. We know that. There will be a lot of drama going on. For now, I want to thank the four of you, even coming from very different perspectives, but certainly contributing your insights and your input. Thank you so much, Wang Yiwei, Steve Pruitt, Morgan Muchnick, and Ian Beck. Thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. Thank you, gentlemen. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, I get up close with Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, who talks about U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis' visit to China. He's in town to have a conversation about security matters between China and the United States. That one-on-one exclusive interview right after this break.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines.
Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Chinese President Xi Jinping has held a meeting with visiting U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis in Beijing. The Pentagon chief said the U.S. attaches great importance to the two countries' military relationship, adding his talks in Beijing have been very good. Mattis began his 3-day visit to China on Tuesday. He is the first defense secretary from the Trump administration to come to China amid tensions between Washington and Beijing over the South China Sea and the issue of Taiwan. Earlier, he met with Chinese Minister of National Defense Wei Fenghe. Would Mattis' visit help improve mutual trust and get the two militaries back on the track to healthy relationship?
The military relationship is critical to the broader relationship between our two countries. And as you said, we have already opened the discussion here today with a very open and honest dialogue.
Your visit will give new, positive elements to the relationship of our two countries and two militaries.
For an in-depth analysis on U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis' visit to China, with me in the studio, we have Senior Colonel Zhou Bo from the Chinese military. He is the director of the Security Cooperation Center with the International Military Cooperation Office of the China's Central Military Commission. Senior Colonel Zhou, what a pleasure to have you here live on the program. Tell me about why both sides, when Chinese President Xi Jinping and the U.S. Defense Secretary Mattis met one another, both of them used two key words: confrontation, conflict. Does it mean that the two countries' relationship is really at an important crossroad?
No, I would not read it like that, because when President Xi talks about it, I know clearly what he means, because the Chinese proposal for China-U.S. relationship has always been no confrontation, no conflict. So because this relationship is so important, being the largest and second largest economy, therefore both sides have been trying the utmost to manage this most important relationship. But the only difference is perspective on different issues.
On different issues, there are different issues.
Yes.
First of all, about the South China Sea issue.
Yeah.
We do see there is the chance that the two militaries would have conflict in the region with the so-called freedom of navigation of the U.S. side in that region. Well, China said very clearly today, Chinese President Xi Jinping said, China on the sovereignty issue is very firm.
Yeah.
So how do you see the prospect? More peace or actually more chances of conflict?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because people are quoting the same article of the UN Convention on Law of the Sea to justify their own position. For the United States, they believe that they are doing freedom of navigation operations, while China believes that these operations actually are a kind of provocation to China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. So we are not reading the same thing in the same light, and because of such a difference, that shows how important we need to actually sit down and talk about this issue. I myself led a delegation to just discuss about the legal implications of this kind of freedom of navigation operations in 2013. The result, very simple, is we agree to disagree, because the UN Convention on Law of the Sea is a product of 9 years negotiation, and for people to reach a kind of conclusion, so there are a lot of ambiguity and compromises.
Come on, I mean, Senior Colonel Zhou, agree to disagree, does that mean just disagree with one another?
Well, because the law itself is ambiguous, and both of us quote the same article, but we quote different paragraphs.
So will cooperation, in terms of communication at least, between the two sides, help to help the two countries in a way to deal with so-called miscalculation, misunderstanding? Both sides this time also use these two words.
Of course, that is a top priority, and that's exactly why China and the U.S. have more confidence building measures than any other countries, because we have talks at different levels, and we have direct communicational links between heads of state and also between top military leadership. And in 2015, we actually have upgraded the direct communicational link into a video telephonic link. That means when we talk to each other, I can read into your eyes.
One of the things that the two sides really need to figure out is how to deal with crisis, because crisis could happen under the current political atmosphere. So is there anything that happened before between these two militaries that could be of inspiration for the current mil-to-mil relationship?
Well, certainly we could have one example of the collision of the Chinese J-8 with American EP-3 in China's exclusive economic zone in Hainan Island. That was most unfortunate, but through skillful diplomatic and political maneuver, we have been able to resolve this issue. The result is the American cruise was released in 11 days, while China has what China described as a kind of apology, actually two sorries from the American administration.
But Senior Colonel Zhou, people would argue that the political atmosphere now And the trajectory of the relationship between the two countries is very different compared to, let's just say, 17 and 18 years ago when that incident happened. And now you see bilateral relations, particularly trade disputes, could have the danger of spilling over to the other side of the bilateral relations. So is male-to-male relationship also in the danger of having an ill impact as a result?
I think there is such a danger because the trade issue, although totally different, could cast a long shadow over the whole bilateral relationship. But the fact that James Mattis came to China to discuss about this issue, and he also talked about the two sides of the same coin, because I remember clearly when I was at the Shangri-La dialogue that he mentioned, quote, China's militarization of the South China Sea, but he also mentioned that the two militaries should cooperate wherever possible. And he even described a role in the Americans' prescribed Indo-Pacific concept. So he talked about the two sides of the same coin, and he also talked about his upcoming visit to China. The important thing is, even during Shangri-La dialogue, the Chinese delegation, although dissatisfied as the Chinese people with the disinvitation of China to attend RIMPAC, have anyway expressed our sincere invitation to him to visit China. So that shows our self-confidence and our generosity.
But you also see, Senior Colonel Zhou, according to some American media reports recently, they have been emphasizing and put a special light on India's participation in the Pacific Rim military exercises this time. So it seems that there are different cards being played, at least.
Well, of course, people have been talking about the Quad, the so-called four-country club: India, the United States, Japan, and Australia. But what was the result? Because the people really hold the breath to listen to Prime Minister Modi's keynote speaker at Shangri-La dialogue. But it came as a big surprise to some people because Prime Minister Modi simply described Indo-Pacific as a natural region. He didn't even talk about any military element in it, and probably as a kind of response, Secretary James Mattis' speech the next day has also mentioned something of the Indo-Pacific, but not in a way that would alarm everybody with its military element.
At least in rhetoric so far.
Yes.
So talking about another issue, the Taiwan issue, that is very key to China's national interest.
Of course.
And the Chinese President Xi Jinping said it very clearly, that is not an issue for discussion. It is China's sovereignty. So what about that? Because the U.S. has traditionally had some relations with Taiwan, and recently you see there's possibility of joint military exercises. There's more possibility of arms sales to Taiwan under Taiwan Relations Act. So will this one become once again a very hot button issue?
Well, we certainly are watching very closely at any possible advancement of the relationship between the United States and Taiwan. Actually, things are moving in a negative way, as we have seen in the last year or so. Some of the legislative bills were passed in the United States, which allows Taiwanese and American ships to visit each other, and another bill to allow any officials of the United States to visit Taiwan. We believe those are really, really negative. If should that happen, the Chinese people would never allow it.
Right. Of course, both sides did not give any specific details as to how they discuss these hot button issues and what might be their so-called agreement or their consensus, because they are in a closed-door meeting of these topics. But having said that, though, we see China and the U.S. relation at a very critical juncture. James Mattis, the U.S. Defense Secretary, also used the word great trajectory, and also he looks forward to the bilateral relation to develop in the right direction, even though there's no description as to what they are. Senior Colonel Zhou, from China's perspective, what is this trajectory? And what is and what should be this direction?
Well, that is a good question for him. For us, I believe this is what we have always asked for, a strong and healthy China-U.S. relationship featured with mutual respect, equality, no conflict, and no confrontation. So this is what we have been asking for. And if you look at China's policy, you would find that China's policy is always stable and consistent, because we all ask for the same thing, and we never change our policy, and we never send any confusing signals. It is how the United States should respond to China's policy in this regard.
The Chinese president, when he's meeting with the Defense Secretary of the United States, he said China is not here to do any colonialism, not here to do any expansionism. China is not creating chaos to the world. And he talked about the common ground between China and the United States. What exactly is this common ground? DPRK or something else?
Well, there are so many common grounds between China and U.S.
But will they matter eventually to the overall real nature of the bilateral
Yeah,
relationship?
you're talking about the Korean Peninsula. Yes, we have a common ground in the denuclearized Korean Peninsula. And in terms of bilateral relationship, I believe the top priority is crisis management, because no one wants that kind of incident to happen again. And for both of us, we have to make utmost efforts to try all means to make sure that this is a manageable working relationship, to say the least.
What are the all means that you're talking about? The all means, you said you are going to try all means to make sure.
Yeah.
What are these means?
Well, these means that we have to make good use of the existing mechanism. I have talked about some mechanism, and because of the perceived danger, China and the U.S. actually have more such instruments. For example, we have to notify each other about the major military activities. For example, but these concerns are not the same, because China certainly would be more concerned about what is going to happen around my periphery, while the United States would like to find out more about your nuclear program, cyber program, or space program. So we have different concerns. But anyway, we try to manage, and we even have a most important agreement, that is a rule of behavior during the unplanned air and maritime encounters. So that means when we meet each other unplanned, unexpectedly, we should follow certain rules, certain procedures of communication, of operation, to make sure no incidents happen.
Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, what a pleasure to have you on our program, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and see the Weibo from me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team. Thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.